I'm Teisha with Shalom TV's news update for Friday, March the 14th, 2014. In response to more rocket fire on Israel yesterday, Israel's Air Force struck 7 terror sites in Gaza last night. Earlier yesterday, a total of 17 rockets were fired into Israel after the Islamic Jihad had announced a so-called ceasefire. No injuries were reported. The rockets fell in the Sha'ar HaNegev Regional Council, in the Sdot HaNegev Council, and in Sderot, with several earlier in the day also falling in Ashdod and Ashkelon. The Israel Air Force struck targets in southern Gaza in response to the continuing rocket fire yesterday. Palestinian sources in Gaza reported that the IAF's strikes included a smuggling tunnel and a rocket launching pad. As we reported to you yesterday, this follows a barrage of over 60 rockets that were launched into Israel from Gaza Wednesday into Thursday, for which Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility, and the subsequent retaliatory strikes in Gaza from Israel's Air Force and tank unit. Following that, Islamic Jihad had reported that there was a ceasefire in place brokered by Egypt. Israel didn't comment on that, but Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon did say that quiet would be met with quiet, but that if provocations were to continue, there would be consequences. Following the recent rocket fire, the IDF deployed 2 Iron Dome defense batteries near the cities of Beersheba and Ashdod. Earlier yesterday, the IDF issued an emergency air defense call-up of its reserve units. Today seemed to be relatively quiet in southern Israel, although a rocket did land this morning in the Sha'ar HaNegev Regional Council, with no injuries reported. Schools in the areas affected in the south were in session today and were filled with students dressing up for the Jewish holiday of Purim. Chaim Yalin, who is the head of the Eshkol Regional Municipality, told Army Radio today that residents were hoping for quiet and normalcy, and that the children had been looking forward to the holiday, and said we won't allow the rockets to ruin that for them. Condemnation over the rocket attacks this week were heard from the White House, the United Nations, and from visiting British Prime Minister David Cameron, who met yesterday with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. During a press conference with Abbas, Cameron addressed the difficulties of a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians, and said that there was still deep disagreement and mistrust between the two sides that would have to be worked out if a deal was possible. Cameron said there's no outcome that's possible where every Israeli is satisfied, where every Palestinian is satisfied. He said there has to be compromise, and compromise is difficult. Compromise takes bravery. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry now seems to be suggesting that it is a mistake for Israel to insist on Palestinian recognition of Israel as a Jewish state as a central issue of any peace deal. Kerry told members of Congress yesterday that there already was an international law that declares Israel a Jewish state, and that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's demand of the public declaration from the Palestinians doesn't necessarily help the diplomatic process. Kerry told the House Foreign Relations Committee, "I think it's a mistake for some people to be raising it again and again as the critical decider of their attitude toward the possibility of a state and peace," adding, "We've obviously made that clear." He said Jewish state was resolved in 1947 in Resolution 181, where there are more than 30 mentions of Jewish state. In addition, he said Chairman Arafat in 1988 and again in 2004 confirmed that he agreed it would be a Jewish state. Netanyahu has continuously demanded that Palestinian recognition of Israel as a Jewish state is a core issue to any peace deal with the Palestinians. The Palestinians have continuously rejected doing so and have said that they already recognized Israel in 1993, and that categorizing Israel as, quote, a Jewish state would jeopardize the right of return for Palestinian refugees. It had seemed that the framework deal that John Kerry will likely present to Israel and the Palestinians next month would include Palestinian recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. And just last month, the Times of Israel reported that U.S. Ambassador to Israel Dan Shapiro had reiterated such. He said he had told Israel Radio that while it was too early to know what compromises and concessions both sides would make, he said, "I assume that under the framework that we're currently preparing, that we'll see that recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, as the nation state of the Jewish people, and in the end will need to know that this is the end of the conflict, and that's one way of verifying that everyone in the region and all of Israel's neighbors will accept that there is a nation-state of the Jewish people here in the Jewish homeland. Meanwhile, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is due to meet with U.S. President Barack Obama along with Secretary of State Kerry to discuss the framework deal at the White House this coming Monday. One of Israel's most celebrated war heroes, Mayor Harzion, has died at the age of 80. Harzion was one of the founders and best-known members of Israel's legendary Commando Force Unit 101 that conducted counter-raids against Arab terror cells in the 1950s under Ariel Sharon. The former late Prime Minister had described Harzion as the, quote, elite of the elite. And former IDF Chief of Staff, late Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, had called Harzion the best soldier ever to emerge in the IDF. Current Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon called Harzion one of the greatest warriors in the history of the IDF, an audacious, distinctive commander whose influence in molding generations of fighters and units was pivotal. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Harzion was one of our greatest heroes, a man who was steeped in love for the nation and the land. And President Shimon Peres said Harzion was a legend already in his own time, and if not in his own eyes, then in the eyes of all those who knew his bravery. The Jewish Council for Public Affairs held their annual plenum this past weekend in Atlanta, Georgia. Jewish community leaders and representatives from 125 Jewish community relations councils and 16 national Jewish agencies gathered at the four-day conference to learn, debate, and vote on consensus policy. Some of the new policies approved at the event were on human trafficking, the minimum wage, reproductive rights, inclusion and disabilities, international LGBT discrimination, and increasing government support for public higher education. Speakers at the plenum included Washington Institute Senior Fellow David Makovsky in his first public appearance since joining the U.S. Peace Process team. The head of the Episcopal Church presiding Bishop Catherine Jeffords Shorey, Jewish Federations of North America CEO Jerry Silverman, and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League Abe Foxman, who was honored at the event with the Albert D. Chernin Award, given to Jewish leaders whose life work best exemplifies the social justice imperatives of Judaism, Jewish history, and the protection of the Bill of Rights. And turning to our Shalom TV programming for tonight, Friday, March the 14th, live Shabbat services are coming up at 6 o'clock from New York City's Central Synagogue, followed at 7:30 with the opening reception of Light and Shadows, a new exhibit from Israel's Beit HaTfutzot, the Museum of the Jewish People, now on display at Yeshiva University Museum at the Center for Jewish History in New York City. It tells the story of the Jews of Iran. And then at 8 o'clock, the stars of the new Broadway show, The Bridges of Madison County, talk about the show from the 92nd Street Y. And then looking ahead on Sunday, March the 16th at noon, be sure to watch L'Chaim with part 2 of Mark Golub's interview with Peter, Paul, and Mary's Peter Yarrow. Plus, be sure to check our special programming for the Purim holiday this weekend here on Shalom TV and ShalomTV.com. Purim begins Saturday evening and ends Sunday evening. And that's Shalom TV's news update for Friday, March the 14th, 2014. I'm Teisha Bader. Happy Purim, Chag Sameach, and Shabbat Shalom.